Our next presenter brings a perspective that feels particularly urgent and necessary right now. José Hernández Zeind is a licensed clinical professional counselor and clinical fellow here at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. He is currently pursuing a doctorate in psychoanalysis. A graduate of Universidad Juárez Autónoma de Tabasco, his background spans schools, hospitals, and universities across both Mexico and the United States. He has evaluated and supported children, adolescents, and adults through clinical care and psychosocial research. Today, Jose will present on migratory grief, a form of loss that sits at the intersection of culture, displacement, and mourning. His session is titled, Between What Was Left Behind and What May Be Taken. This is work that our field needs. Please welcome Jose.
Hello, everyone. Hola todos. Before I start, I want to say my thank yous. Now that we are in the final stretch, thank you all who have attended the conference, either in person or via Zoom. It's been a nice journey learning together. Thank you to the previous presenters, Froma, Molly, Caroline, and Robert. Your contributions have been significant in many ways. I hope that my colleagues have had a similar experience. Thank you, Lori, for inviting me to speak about a type of grief that is also of the interest of Barr-Harris. Thank you, Jason, for hosting such an incredible event. Also, thank you to the team and staff who have worked toward it. Finally, thank you to my family, my wife, Allison, and my cousin, Alex, for being present. So I'll be speaking for 35 to 40 minutes. After it, I will be more than happy to hear your thoughts on the topic. Migratory grief in the current climate, between what was left behind and what may be taken. In this paper, I explore migratory grief as a clinically distinct and politically shaped phenomenon, one that, under conditions of sustained immigration enforcement, does not merely complicate mourning, but structurally freezes it. Drawing from direct clinical work with Latin American families in Chicago, I propose the concept of frozen mourning to describe a state in which grief is present, known, and felt, yet unable to move. Immobilized not by ambiguity about what was lost, but by the psychic compression produced by chronic fear generated by external conditions of threat. The paper integrates two psychoanalytic pillars: Freud's mechanism of identification with the lost object as the route through which mourning is metabolized, and Ferenczi's ethical emphasis on recognition and empathic witnessing as conditions without which that metabolism cannot begin. Two clinical vignettes anchor the theoretical discussion in lived experience, attending to the ways migratory grief manifests in children, parental bodies, and in the silence of disrupted ritual. The double valence of eyes, immigration and customs enforcement, and the affective coldness it generates is held throughout as a structural metaphor. Where there is ice, mourning cannot flow, and yet warmth, recognition, and shared language can begin to thaw what fear has frozen. Opening, a clinician between two countries. I want to begin personally because I think that it matters what follows. In September 2021, I arrived in Chicago from Tabasco, Mexico, a tropical state in the southeast of the country, where the air is thick and the rivers run wide and slow. I knew I would be doing clinical work, and I knew it would be in a new language. What I did not anticipate was the population I would serve, nor how fully that work would speak to something I was already carrying. I was hired by a community mental health agency serving primarily Hispanic families in the Chicago area. Many of my clients were migrants, some recently arrived, navigating a new city, often a new kind of fear. The sessions were in Spanish, sometimes woven through with the children's English, and always shaped by an unspoken weight that took me some time to name. Something I knew from the beginning and did not need time to arrive at was that I too was a migrant. I came with a different documentation status, but I had also left behind a landscape, a family, a way of being in the world. And I knew, walking certain streets, that my body was not exempt from being read a particular way. Brown, Latino, foreign. Eyes does not check visa stamps before it looks at a face. In that sense, I was and remain a target. This is not a claim of equivalence with my client's experience. Their fear was structurally different and far more acute. But it is a statement of position. I'm not speaking from outside this experience. I'm speaking from somewhere within it. That position shaped the work, and it shapes this paper. What I began to notice session after session was that the people in front of me were not primarily presenting symptoms of depression or anxiety, though those were often present. What they were presenting was grief that could not move, grief that had become, for lack of a better word at the time, frozen. The clinical question that has organized my thinking ever since is, what happens to mourning when the conditions for mourning are systematically denied? Migratory grief, a phenomenological account. Migratory grief is not a new concept, but it is often under-described in clinical literature and insufficiently differentiated from other grief presentations. I want to trace its contours carefully before introducing the particular complication that the current moment brings. And I want to do so with the awareness that I'm speaking among colleagues whose expertise in grief is deep. My aim is not to survey the field, but to describe what I have seen. To migrate is to lose. This sounds obvious, but its clinical implications are not always recognized. The losses involved in migration are not singular, sequential, or bounded by a discrete event. They are multiple, layered, and ongoing, unfolding across months and years in ways that resist easy narration. A migrant loses geographic continuity, the neighborhood, the smell of a particular market, the sound of a rain on a specific roof. They lose temporal continuity, the rhythms of seasons and local life that anchored a sense of being in time. They lose relational proximity, parents, siblings, grandparents, friends who remain behind, present in memory and in the small screens of phones, absent in embodied life. They lose social recognition, the subtle but powerful experience of being known in a community, of having a name that carries meaning, a history that precedes an introduction. They also lose imagined futures. Migration often involves the foreclosure of a life that was planned or hoped for, a career trajectory, a social role, a particular way of growing old, and their loss is mourned, even when they never fully existed. Crucially, these losses do not end at the border. They continue to unfold. The first year in a new country is not the end of migratory grief. It is often the beginning. As the initial adrenaline of arrival subsides and the scale of what has changed becomes legible, the work of mourning can start, or it can be prevented from starting. There is one more dimension worth naming, the grief of children who migrate, and of children born here to migrant parents. Their experience is not identical to their parents, but it is formed by it in profound ways. A child raised in a household haunted by unspoken mourning, does not escape that mourning. She inherits its texture without always having access to its name. The current climate, enforcement, fear, and psychic compression. Migratory grief is always shaped by context. In the current sociopolitical climate of the United States, that context has become particularly severe. Heightened immigration enforcement, expanded detention operations, increased visibility of ICE activity in immigrant communities, and a sustained rhetoric of threat and criminalization has produced an atmosphere of chronic fear. Families who have lived here for years, who have built routines, children in school, networks of care, now navigate daily life in a particular vigilance. Is it safe to drive, to walk to the pharmacy, to take the child to a hospital? This hypervigilance is not irrational. It is a calibrated response to a real and present danger, but it carries profound psychic costs. The constant monitoring of the environment for threat consumes the cognitive and emotional resources that might otherwise be available for other kinds of psychic work, including grief. What I have observed clinically is that fear and grief do not simply coexist in these families. Fear actively displaces grief. When the survival system is chronically activated, the mourning system cannot function adequately. The psychic space required for grief, the capacity to remember, to yearn, to symbolize, to be moved by loss, is compressed by vigilance. Grief is still present, but it cannot move. This is the condition I'm calling frozen mourning. Frozen mourning is not ambiguous loss in Pauline Boss sense, where the object's status is unclear. In frozen mourning, the losses are known and felt. What is frozen is not certainty about the object, but the capacity to process what is already known. The difficulty is not intrapsychic, but structural. It is produced at the intersection of the individual psyche and the external environment of sustained threat. The word frozen carries a double resonance that I can find clinically and conceptually significant. It invokes the psychic coldness, the affective numbing, and narrowing of expression that I have repeatedly observed in clients living under enforcement conditions. And it names directly the institution whose presence organizes so much of this fear, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, iced, cold, frozen. The acronym condenses something exact: enforcement as a force that chills community life, freezes bodies in hypervigilance, and prevents the natural movement of grief. What needs warmth to unfold is met instead with cold. Clinical vignette. The girl at the hospital. I want to share a clinical vignette that for me crystallized much of what I've been describing. A mother brought her 12-year-old daughter to the community agency where I worked after the girl had been hospitalized following a suicide attempt involving self-harm and ingestion of medications. I later learned from the mother that she had wanted to take her daughter to therapy for 5 months prior to the hospitalization. She had noticed for months that something was not right. The girl had stopped eating well. She was withdrawing. She came home from school silent in a way that felt different from ordinary adolescent silence. But the mother had not sought help. When I asked why she had waited, she told me quietly, ICE was very active. She said it simply, as a fact of the landscape, the way someone might say it was raining. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. What finally moved her to act was a combination of two things: the severity of the hospitalization, in a sense that eyes had become slightly less visible in the weeks before. Not safety, just a marginal reduction in immediate terror. In the hospital, the mother told me they were not offered a Spanish language interpreter promptly. She spent the first hours of her daughter's psychiatric admission not fully understanding what was happening to the child, what was being assessed, what treatments were being considered. The procedures unfolded in a language she could not access, in an institution that felt large, impersonal, and foreign, in a moment of extreme fear. I also reached out to coordinate care with the school social worker, who confirmed that following the hospitalization, a safety plan and a structured reintegration plan had been developed. But when we spoke, she mentioned that there was no one in the school district who spoke Spanish. The forms had been completed, the protocols had been followed, and yet the mother's investment in her daughter's recovery was repeatedly met with systems that could not receive it, not because of lack of care, but because the infrastructure for recognition was simply absent. When the mother spoke to me about all of this, she did not cry. Her face remained composed in a way that I had come to recognize, not as absence of feeling, but as the surface of something that had been made still. Affect was present, but it was not moving. It was, in the precise sense I'm trying to describe, frozen. In subsequent sessions with the daughter, I began to understand the layers of her grief. She left behind a country, a grandmother, a school, a neighborhood. She had arrived in a place where her peers called her migrant as a slur, where she was marked as foreign, where her parents' mourning, not only where her parents' immobility under fear had become the ambient atmosphere of the household. The daughter was mourning not only what was left behind, the life before the crossing, but also the sense of safety she had perhaps never fully possessed since arrival. And she was mourning preemptively what might still be taken. What made this vignette particularly striking clinically was the parallel structure of frozen affect across generations. The mother, who could not act for months because fear had frozen her capacity to seek help, and the daughter, surrounded by that frozen atmosphere, had no container for her own distress and had found a dangerous outlet for it. The grief was present at every level, and at every level, it could not move. Freud, identification with the lost object. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud mapped the psychic process through which loss is metabolized. When someone or something significant is lost, the libido, the psychic investment that animated the relationship, does not simply dissolve. It requires a process of gradual withdrawal from the lost object and eventual reinvestment elsewhere. This process is painful and slow, and it involves what Freud called the testing of reality, the incremental acknowledgement, piece by piece, that the object is gone. Freud distinguished mourning from melancholia. In mourning, the ego remains intact, and the work of grief, though painful, proceeds towards some form of completion. In melancholia, the ego becomes identified with the lost object in a more entangled way. The loss turns inward, and self-reproach, depletion, and withdrawal follow. For migrant families, the distinction is clinically useful but insufficient on its own. The losses involved, in migration are not clean or finalized. One cannot mourn a living grandmother who remains in Oaxaca as one mourns a dead one. The object is lost, but not gone. Present in calls and photograph, absent in embodied life. The losses accumulate and interact, making the testing of reality particularly complex. More importantly for my argument, Freud's model of mourning assumes a degree of psychic freedom, the availability of the ego to do the slow internal work of grief. When that freedom is constrained by chronic external threat, the process cannot unfold. The libido cannot be gradually withdrawn from the lost object and reinvested elsewhere because the psychic space required for that process is being frozen by fear and vigilance from without. There is a second Freudian thread I want to pull, the withdrawal of libido from the present. In normal mourning, libido moves, it detaches from what was lost, and over time finds new objects. In frozen mourning, I have observed a particular phenomenon. Not only does libido remain partially attached to what was left behind, it also withdraws from the present, from this neighborhood, this school, this country, because the present itself feels precarious, threatened, not safe to invest in. To love what you may lose is psychically a risk. The ego adapts by withholding full investment. Clinically, this manifests as a kind of suspended presence. The body is here, the person functions, but the sense of being at home in one's current life is withheld, not as pathology, but as adaptation, not as failure, but as a reasonable response to unreasonable conditions. I saw this clearly in a second family I worked with over 2 years, a couple from Mexico with 2 children born here, navigating life without family support in the United States. I had begun seeing their adolescent daughter for concerns about conduct at school, and we made progress. What initially appeared as misbehavior turned out to be a search for attention, for a particular quality of being looked at and cared for that she was not finding at home. The work was moving. Then the current administration took office, and something shifted in the family, not gradually, but almost overnight. The parents began coming to sessions alongside their daughter, and what I encountered there was a near total suspension of the affective movement we had built. The sessions became factual, careful, minimal. The parents left the house only when they had to work, because without work, there was no survival. They were angry, frightened, and exhausted. The anger could barely be spoken. The fear occupied all available space. It took several sessions before something could begin to move again. What finally shifted was not external situation. The fear did not diminish. What shifted was the capacity to name, quietly and with pain, a possibility that had until then been unspeakable. The possibility of returning to Mexico, of going back, of a home that was no longer here. The word home itself had migrated back. And allowing that sentence to exist in the room, fragile, tentative, threaded through with grief, was, I think, the beginning of thawing. Ferenczi, recognition, listening, and the ethical encounter. If Freud gives us the mechanism, Ferenczi gives us the relational conditions without which that mechanism cannot begin to work. Ferenczi's contribution to trauma theory, particularly in the clinical diary and confusion of tongues, more than because of the content of the theory itself, but the adaptation of his technique, was to insist on the destructive role of non-recognition. It is not only the traumatic event itself that harms, it is the disavowal of that event, the failure of witness to acknowledge what has happened. When a person's reality is denied by those who are supposed to confirm it, the psychic damage is compounded. The experience becomes, in a sense, unspeakable, not because it is inexpressible, but because there is no one to receive it. Ferenczi called for empathic attunement, a relational ethics in which the therapist does not maintain an impassive distance, but genuinely receive the patient's experience. This was radical in his time and remains clinically significant today. In the context of migratory grief, Ferenci's framework points to something that is at once obvious and frequently missed. For frozen mourning to begin to thaw, someone must first say, in whatever form, that what you're carrying is real, that your grief is legitimate, that your fear is not irrational, that your losses are losses. This recognition is not a technical intervention, it's an ethical posture, and it is frequently absent in the institutional encounters that migrant families navigate: hospitals, schools, government offices, sometimes clinics. Families who arrive to seek care and encounter systems that require English, that process them efficiently, that ask about symptoms without asking about lives. These families receive a form of institutional non-recognition that compounds what they already experience socially. The mother who spent hours in a psychiatric hospital without a Spanish interpreter was not only navigating a logistical barrier, she was experiencing again a form of erasure. Her distress was present, it was not seen. Her language and everything it carries, her history, her way of thinking, her particular grief, was not met. And the school district's reintegration plan, completed without anyone who spoke Spanish, completed by people who could not fully understand what had happened to this family or how to support them, that was too a form of Ferencian non-recognition, not malicious, but consequential. The clinical implication is clear. Before any theoretical framework of mourning can be applied, there must be Ferencian recognition. The grieving person must experience themselves as visible to another, heard, real. In practice, this sometimes begins with something as simple as conducting the session in Spanish, not merely as a linguistic accommodation, but as a signal. Your language is welcome here. What it carries is welcome here. You are not required to translate yourself into a more legible form before you are allowed to suffer. It also means creating space for the migration itself to be narrated. Many of the families I have worked with cross through dangerous terrain to arrive here, through the jungle, the Darien Gap, through Central America, through Mexico, each leg of the journey carrying its own fear and its own losses. These journeys are not only logistical histories, they are experiences that have not been witnessed, that have not been held. To offer a space where that story can be told, in a language the clinician speaks, with a presence that does not flinch, inside an institution that the legal system would deny them access to, is itself a form of recognition. Sometimes it is the first one. There is one more thing I want to name about my position in this work. As a brown Latino clinician, I am also a target. ICE does not ask for documentation before it reads a face. When my patients spoke of their fear of enforcement, I was not listening from a place of clinical distance. I was listening from a place of partial overlap. I chose to allow some of that to be present in the room, not to center myself, not to claim equivalence, but to signal, I know this is real, I'm not above it, and I'm still here. From a Ferencian point of view, the therapist's authentic presence, not performance, not technique, is what creates the relational conditions for grief to become possible. In this particular clinical context, I believe that presence included something that cannot be fully separated from the body. The fact of being visibly brown in a room where fear of racialized enforcement was the shared atmosphere. That shared racialized position, carefully held, never used to displace the patient's experience, was itself a form of recognition, a way of saying your reality does not need to be translated for me. I am already, in some sense, inside it. Frozen mourning, a clinical proposition. I want to gather what I have been describing into more precise formulation. Frozen mourning, as I'm using the term, describes a state in which grief is present and known, but is structurally immobilized by external conditions of sustained threat. It is distinct from several related concepts in the clinical literature. It differs from complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, which locate the difficulty primarily within the individual's intrapsychic process. Frozen mourning locates the difficulty at the intersection of the individual psyche and the social and political environment. The grief is not complicated because of the person's internal structure. It is frozen because of the condition in which that person must live. It differs from ambiguous loss, which describe grief where the status of the object is uncertain. Poss herself illustrates this with figures such as a missing person whose fate is unknown, or someone living with dementia who is physically present but psychically unreachable. In frozen mourning, by contrast, the losses are not ambiguous. They are known and felt. What is frozen is not certainty about the object, but the capacity to elaborate what is already known. And it also differs from traumatic grief, which typically involves a violent or sudden loss. Frozen mourning may follow gradual, cumulative losses that would not individually meet the threshold of trauma, but whose accumulation under conditions of chronic threat produces a similar immobilization. The clinical phenomenology of frozen mourning includes several characteristic features. There is often a flattening of affect that is not depression in the classical sense. The person can be activated, responsive, even warm, but a particular constriction around loss-related material. Narratives of the past home, the crossing, the current fear are delivered in a register that is factual rather than felt. The facts are present, but the feeling is held somewhere else. There is frequently a withdrawal of libido from the present, a hesitation to invest in this neighborhood, this school, this country, not because the person does not care, but because caring feels dangerous when the present feels provisional. And there is often a disruption of ritual. The mourning practices that in the culture of origin would have provided the structure for grief are curtailed, hidden, or made impossible. Grief needs form. When the forms are unavailable, grief becomes formless. It persists without the containers that allow it to be experienced and released. Ice is not the absence of water. It is water that cannot flow. Frozen mourning is not the absence of grief. It is grief that cannot move. And this, I think, is why warmth matters. not metaphorically, but clinically. The warmth of a therapeutic space, of a community gathering, of being addressed in one's own language. These are not amenities, they are conditions under which thawing becomes possible. Ritual, community, and the conditions for thawing. If fear is the forces that freezes, what are the forces that allow mourning to move? I want to resist the temptation to offer a list of clinical techniques here, because I think that framing misses something important. The conditions that thaw frozen mourning are not primarily technical. They are relational, communal, and I will say it, political. At the relational level, what matters is recognition. In the Ferencian sense, a therapist who can hear what is being said and also what is not being said, who can sit with a mother who does not cry and recognize the grief behind the stillness, who does not require the patients to perform grief in legible forms before taking it seriously. At the communal level, what matters is the availability of shared mourning practices. In many Latin American traditions, grief is not primarily private. It is conducted collectively through ritual, through gathering, through the shared acknowledgement of loss. El Día de Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is not merely a cultural tradition. It is a collective mourning device, a structured social form for bringing grief into communal space, for making loss visible and therefore survivable. It is a form of mourning that belongs to everyone. In diaspora communities in Chicago, these traditions persist, but they are sometimes practiced in diminished or hidden ways. Families who fear drawing attention to themselves may not participate in public gatherings. Communities under surveillance constrict their collective expression. The grief that needs to be held communally is again forced inward, again frozen. I want to share something that I think that illustrates this precisely. Where I live, in Oak Park, the village has for years organized a Día de Muertos, the Day of the Dead celebration. Altars placed throughout the city, a walking route for the community to visit them. A collective act of public mourning that the municipality itself sustained as an annual practice. This past year, 2025, the village canceled it. The decision was framed as an act of care for its inhabitants, a recognition that in the current climate, gathering publicly felt risky for immigrant families. I understand the intention, and I think it is worth pausing on what that cancellation means psychically. The ritual was canceled not because grief had diminished, but because fear had grown. The collective mourning device was withdrawn precisely when it was most needed, not despite concern for the community, but because of it. The result is a community whose grief has nowhere to go, the eyes held. Clinical work in this context cannot be only individual. It must be attentive to community, to what shared spaces exist or can be created for mourning. A clinician working with migrant families is also implicitly a clinician working with the community's capacity to grieve. What warms frozen mourning in my clinical experience is often simple. It is being spoken to in one's own language, being asked about the journey, not only about symptoms, being offered a space in which the migration itself can be narrated. The weeks crossing through jungle, through Central America, through Mexico, before arriving here, a space in which an experience that the legal system calls illegal can be held and witnessed inside the very institution that the system excludes them from. Sometimes it is silence, shared silence, the kind that says, I know you are carrying something I cannot fully see. I'm here anyway. Closing, holding the cold. 50 years ago, Barr-Harris was founded on the conviction that children's grief matters, that it is real, that it has consequences, and that it deserves clinical attention and care. That conviction feels particularly urgent today. The families I've been describing, one recently arrived, the other with years already in this country, are carrying grief in both directions. Grief for what was left behind and grief for what may still be taken. Their children are growing up in households where the affective atmosphere is shaped by losses that are not fully speakable, by a fear that is rational and exhausting, by a particular kind of cold. Psychoanalytic theory gives us tools to understand this. Freud's account of how mourning works and what prevents it. Ferenczi's insistence on recognition as a clinical and ethical necessity. These tools are not merely historical. They are, I think, precisely suited to what we are seeing in clinical practice today. The concept of frozen mourning is my attempt to name something I have observed repeatedly, something I believe warrants clinical attention as a distinct phenomenon. Grief that is present but immobilized, that needs not to be resolved or processed away, but first to be thought, to be recognized, to be given form, and to be allowed to move. The work of thawing is not dramatic. It is slow. It happens in small moments of attunement, in sessions conducted in the language that carries the grief, in the presence of a clinician who can hear the silence behind a composed face, in communities that find ways to gather and remember even when they are afraid. I began this paper personally, and I want to close that way too. There is a particular stillness that a room takes on when someone is grieving without elaboration for their grief. I have sat in that stillness many times. It does not always feel clinical. It feels often simply human. Two people in a small room, one of them carrying something heavy, the other trying to be present to it without looking away. That presence, the willingness not to look away, is where the clinical works begin. Not in technique, not in interpretation, in the holding, in the warmth of being seen. For the families I work with and for the children who are inheriting their grief, what is needed is not only better interventions, it is spaces, clinical, communal, institutional, where what they carry can be acknowledged, witnessed, and with time, allowed to flow. Thank you. I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts, if you have any, or your emotions, or your.
The online.
Oh, thank you, thank you. So I know that this could be not a very easy topic to talk and to share. Sometimes it's kind of bothering for some and disturbing and uncomfortable, but it's necessary, and it's great that we can find these kind of spaces to be talking about this. Yeah, thank you for reaching me in the first place in Spanish. That was incredible. When you say hi to me, it was great to hear Spanish. Thank you. So thank you for sharing this time with me, and I hope this could be serving as a new idea. Oh, Vanessa.
Get so caught up in clinical technical interventions when at this level of dehumanization that's happening across so many communities, that change it goes a long way. Thank you.
Sure, and one last thing to say, not because I want to become theoretical, but I'm visibly brown, I'm Latino, and I don't want to take this as a biological advantage. I've been thinking about it, I've been writing about it, and it is our racialized bodies that get activated because of eyes. That's what the atmosphere, that's the atmosphere that had allowed me to be working with the patients. Not because I don't want to take my body as a biological advantage. Is a social phenomenon in activation of for example, in this case, the eye rates that create this phenomenon that allows me to happen, like to be there with my patients. So yeah. Thank you very much.